Mademoiselle from Armentières, parlez-vous? Mademoiselle from Armentières, parlez-vous? Mademoiselle from Armentières, she hasn't been kissed in 40 years. Parlez-vous?
I've obviously got a great affection for 16 Squadron. And once I'd finished doing my research on Naval 8, I thought I'll have a look at 16. And because one was a fighter squadron and the other one was Army Cooperation, it's a totally different game altogether, absolutely different. And so I found it very, very interesting seeing the sort of things that they did. So the idea for today then is to give you an idea of what the Army Cooperation squadrons did through the eyes of 16. The scope of the talk is I'll give you a brief overview of the sort of things that happened, the aircraft and the aerodromes they flew from, the roles they performed, a sequence of significant events and personal stories, and then a summary, and if you're still alive at the end of it, you can ask some questions. Okay, so 1914, the main thing about aviation was the need for intelligence. The Royal Flying Corps became what the cavalry could do. They were very effective at getting out, looking for something, finding it, and then reporting it back. It was very haphazard how they set about doing it, and things needed to sort of compress and get into the right sort of frame, and they needed the right structures. But at first, they were very, very useful to the commanders because they could find out where the opposition was without actually going out there on horseback, sketching on their arm and then coming back and telling them what was happening. It all happened much quicker. Okay, so the need for intelligence was there. Now, General French, he was a career cavalryman, but he welcomed the air reconnaissance because he could see the aviation could open up so many more borders for them. And what they did was they developed aviation roles. In the Battle of Aisne, they switched from just recording where things were and doing the reconnaissance to actually pinpointing targets for the artillery. It was a bit Heath Robertson, drop a bag, leave a message where the artillery was, and then they'd fire on it, but there was no reporting back or anything like that. There was no radio. But it helped, and they realised. And what they did at that stage was the aircrew would have a map lined with 400-yard squares. The artillery officer would have exactly the same map, and they would use that. And what this also highlighted was that the maps that they were using were particularly poor. You know, a lot of the cases they were using Michelin road maps and things like this at the time. The squadrons born. Basically, the RAF went out with 6 squadrons, one of which was balloons, and they needed more. They needed more aviation. And the War Office promised Trenchard another 9 squadrons. Why was 16 Squadron the first squadron in that second tranche? Because Trenchard was very political and said, if I put 16 Squadron as the first one and there's no 11 Squadron, people are going to say, what on earth happened to that? It was his way of ensuring he got all the 9 squadrons he'd been promised. So he was very political on that sort of thing. Now, I've just said that the second tranche, the first squadron was 16 Squadron. If somebody was here from 9 Squadron, they'd be shouting, saying, no, we were there before you and all this sort of thing. 9 Squadron are always arguing with people. You know, there's the 617 Squadron, they're always going on about turpits. And with 16 Squadron, they claim that they're the first squadron. They were actually an experimental squadron, so it's fair to say that they were active, but it was effectively a flight at that stage. So 16 Squadron formed, and the aircraft they had were a gun bus, 2 Martinsyde Scouts, 2 RE5s, 3 Blériots. And for the rest of 1915, they gradually went down to Morris Farman Shorthorn and the Voisin. So they were a real ragtag of aircraft. And all along, for a while, they just kept going on with these different aircraft. Eventually, the BE-2, the real workhorse, came in. and they got from C to G. It could do 3 hours to 5 hours, ideal for an army patrol aircraft. Very stable, which is the last thing you want if you're fighting, but the first thing you want if you're taking photographs. So that was it. Now we've got a Captain Davidson, who was an observer, and he talks about the Lewis gun. The observer was given a flexible Lewis gun, but fire from his cramped cockpit, he was actually in the front, was very limited. The engine and propeller masked everything ahead. The top plane, umbrella-like, masked almost all of the upward field of fire, while the bottom plane, in the centre of which he sat, did the same downwards. The fuselage and tail plane, with the pilot's head sticking out, obscured most of the rearward field. He was given 3 pillar mountings for his gun, one in each forward corner of his cockpit for fire in small arcs up and down between the propeller and planes on each side. A 3rd pillar provided for fire aft. He had to transfer the gun from one mounting to another according to the direction he wanted to shoot. In order to shoot at all, he had to undo his safety belt and kneel in his seat. It takes little imagination to picture his difficulties in a bucking aircraft in a dogfight. The only arc which he was likely to get a well-aimed shot was a small one just over the pilot's head. So again, it fills me with horror, the fact that you're going to have to unstrap and lug this gun, this Lewis gun around to fire. It sort of gives you an impression of what those men were like. The other aircraft, and I'll go on to this much later, was the RE-8. A lot of people called it the Harry Tate after a music hall performer. It was a big improvement, but I'll go on to that in detail. It was a bit faster and it was a bit more automatic for the cameras. Okay, the airfields that they worked from then. If you look just there, we've got Lagorgue is the first airfield. They formed in Saint-Omer, that's why they're called the Saints. I've got the squadron tie on at the moment. They formed at Lagorgue in March, and in June they went to Merville. Because of the wet weather at Merville, they moved back to Lagorgue, and then eventually they moved to Bray in September 16, really to get ready to work with, first with the Australians, and then they went into working with the Canadians prior to Vimy Ridge. They then moved after Vimy Ridge to Camblain so that they could be close to the Canadian headquarters. It was much closer to the front line there. One of the flight commanders in 1915 talks about Lagorgue aerodrome. It was situated near the River Lys. It was L-shaped, each leg being in the region of 200 yards long. One leg was alongside the canal, and the approach to the other, slightly shorter leg, was through a gap of poplar trees over the canal onto the narrow grass strip, beside which were the canvas hangars. A few hundred yards away were the farmhouse and buildings that were used as squadron offices and workshops. I was posted on to B Flight, which lived on the aerodrome, sleeping in lorries and small tents. A Flight were accommodated in a filthy cattle shed on the farm. C Flight had the best billet of all, for they lived in a well-equipped 200-ton barge moored on the Lys Canal. If you read a book by Grenell Milne, Wind in the Wires, he goes on about this quite a lot. I don't actually use Grenell Milne very much. He's very self-opinionated. He absolutely hated Dowding and his flight commanders, and he never ever put a foot wrong at any stage. I don't think he gives a very balanced account of what it was like. It's a very interesting book, but it's very much a me book. Right, so we'll go on to the core aircraft roles then. So they did aerial reconnaissance and photography, artillery cooperation, contact patrols, bombing, special missions, and we'll now just talk about the aerial reconnaissance. They needed timely information. The cavalry were effectively obsolete, especially once the war became static. General French said, "The RFC are becoming more and more indispensable factor in combined operations. The ingenuity and skill displayed by officers of the RFC has been most marked." So French obviously had a lot of time for the RFC. The mobile war in 1914 then, this was a bit of a nightmare because they'd be taking off to a place, they'd go and do their recce report, they'd land somewhere and find that the squadron's moved. There'd be one tender left there, and then they'd be filled up with petrol from the tender and then be told to go and find where they were supposed to be. There are lots of accounts of people being away for 5 or 6 days searching around to find their squadron, you know, and it was all a little bit difficult, and it was a very fluid situation. At least they could move quickly to get through with that. When we come to the static warfare, things, as they would, settled down. And the agreement was really, initially, get the rolling stock wrecked so that they could preempt any German build-ups of forces. And the whole idea was use the recce to try and predict what was going to go on tactically so that they could move their reserves around as well. So they did the reconnaissance quite regularly. They did tactical artillery reconnaissance, not necessarily helping with the shoots, and they got the landing grounds as close to the artillery HQ as possible so that they could then get the information. I think at this stage it's worth coming on to the RAF command structure. I think most people know of Trenchard, father of the Royal Air Force. We were certainly brought up with him as the man. I don't think there's an RAF station without Trenchard Street, Close or whatever. But in truth, there was Major Sykes and Brigadier Henderson were very much the men in the background doing the really, really useful work. They were very, very good organisers. They really had systems set up very quickly, which, in fact, to be honest, are still used today. They used very logical progressions in the way they would operate, and they made sure things were logged, and they kept diaries, and they had an idea of what they were doing so they could then improve amongst that. And they set the tone right the way through. So both Sykes and Henderson, they're both fairly forgotten, but they were absolutely essential. Trenchard, who didn't really, he was very much he was known as Boom. He was very much slightly incoherent. He used to say to his PA, take that down. He was known as Boom because he got a big booming voice. He was loved by the guys as well, and he sort of kept that persona of what the RFC was about. And he was very keen on aggression as well, making sure that we had an aggressive force, not a defensive one. Another person to go in that's very important when it comes to all the photography and all the other things was Lord, as he became, Brabazon, More Brabazon. There's his pilot's license. He was on 9 Squadron as part of the experimental flight to develop artillery cooperation, wireless and photography. He was landed gentry, and although he was only a lieutenant, he was once told by a colonel, be more polite to your superior officers. And he retorted, do you mean my senior officers? So I don't think he was short on confidence. He was joined by a guy called Sergeant Laws, who became Flight Sergeant Laws, who became a group captain when he left the army and joined the Air Force in 1919. He was really responsible for the technical element of developing the photographs and also the cameras. So he was a really essential person. You see lots and lots of reports from different Army Corporation squadrons, and they all knew Laws. You know, he was, again, the man in the background doing all the technical stuff. Initially, crews sketched things on boards, just like they'd done in the army, in the cavalry. And gradually, things came through. So if we go on to the aerial photography, one flight of 16 Squadron with 4 aircraft, basically a separate unit would operate. And they were there for the photographic and reconnaissance element. And you'd have 2 flights of artillery, so for the 3 squadrons. The aerial photography really, it all started up. A lot of pilots got airborne and took some happy snaps so that they could use them when they got home at Christmas after they'd won the war, and have some souvenirs of things. And one of these people on 3 Squadron, Lieutenant Charles Daly, he took lots of photos. He was a very keen photographer, and he processed them himself. He bought the chemicals himself in Bethune, and he had a quick look at them, and he started doing photographic interpretation, and he realised that there was a lot of potential with this. So he went to the Corps headquarters, and they also realised the potential, and Brabazon and Laws then got involved, and they produced a prototype Alpha or A camera. So they've got the process in there, and they had these handheld cameras. Again, put yourself in a BE2, carrying a camera like that. You've got to point it in the right place. After each sortie, everything's taken back down to the photo section at wing headquarters for development, fixing, printing and distribution. And eventually what they started to do was produce an aerial map mosaic of what was going on. And this really was the forerunner of the first British trench map, which was February 1915. So if you think, within 3 months, they'd got as far as having trench maps, which is quite advanced, really. Okay, so this was handheld. It had a lot of aircraft vibration, and they had to change the slides in flight. Again, just do it in a 70-mile-an-hour gale. Just think about it. It's not the easiest thing in the world. They didn't have a very easy job. We'll give you an idea. This is the Type C aerial camera, which came in late summer 1915. And this had a magazine of 18 plates, which were stored with the camera as well. And I'll go on to Archibald James, ex-Etonian, a lord eventually, a parliamentarian, and I'll get him to explain to you about taking the photographs.
Photographs were taken with a hand camera through a hole in the floor, and I became rather the star photographer, being very small and able to bend down and adjust the camera, which one had to hold in one's hands. One only took about 6 plates, which one had to change by hand. On landing, after taking photographs, which one did of things like supposed battery positions or railway junctions, one took them straight to Moore Brabazon's office, where, with his first-class sergeant, Sergeant Laws, they were developed. And one waited there while they were developed to have a look at them, because Brab would to make comments on the fact one had been inaccurate in one's pointing at the camera. I always remember one day when the photographs were developed, they were the right place, but unfortunately Brab had forgotten to change the film in his own camera, in the camera he used himself, and superimposed on all my pictures was a beautiful white horse of some dude come to lunch.
I think he says it a lot better than anyone could. His accent is perfect from the day there. He didn't suffer fools gladly, I don't think, this chap. When Peter Hart interviewed him, Peter Hart's boss interviewed him, and Peter went for the second one. He said, "You're not bringing that idiot with the recorder again, are you?" Okay, so we'll go on to aerial photography. There were 2 types, really. The tactical photography, which they tried to do every other day, if they could, all around the line, within 5 miles of the line. So any changes they'd be able to see. Obviously, that's not necessarily they weren't able to do it every time if you had really bad weather. But the main aim was every other day. And then they would go on to the strategic, which was up to 30 miles behind the lines, hated by the guys, because if you did the long reconnaissance, you were easy meat. Nobody liked doing it. It came up about once a week, and they for the people, and they really didn't like doing it very much at all. Here's an interesting fact. The receipt to Corps of the photographs was 50 minutes from aircraft landing. And if you consider, I remember seeing a program in the 1970s about the RAF, and they had the mobile aerial photography in reconnaissance people at 2 Squadron. They did a fly past, and then 20 minutes later they showed it on BBC. You know, but it was only about 20 minutes longer in the First World War. And bear in mind the difficulties they might have had trying to get back for something like that. Things went on. They started to do oblique photography for the infantry to use for their planning, so that they could actually see the layout of the land as well. And they found that very useful for things like the Somme and also at Vimy Ridge. They gradually went on to the stereoscopic, where they took the 2 photos at the same time, and they still use this today. They were still using it in 2006 in Afghanistan, where you get a picture and it becomes like 3D. Anybody that saw the D-Day things where they were talking about a couple of the people at Bletchley were looking, and they found things, you know, that were hidden, like V1 bases, using the same stuff, the stereoscopic photographs. They're like the 1960s viewfinders that you used to get, you know, with free things with the cornflakes and stuff like that. Okay, here's a trench photo from 1917. Clearly marks the lines there. And we've got one from 1918, presumably after the Kaiserslautern, in the more open ground. And then we go on to the mosaic photo. This is the guys in the booth there trying to make up the mosaic photo, so they've got it. And you can see there the crew's being debriefed at the same time. Okay, so that gives you an idea of the reconnaissance and the photography. We go on to the artillery cooperation. Initially, this is very, very primitive. And Davidson says about observer training, there were few facilities for training newly joined observers. In fact, just about all observers came from the artillery or infantry on a six-week detachment initially. So there was no expertise other than they'd been artillery people. Who were obliged under the circumstances to learn from experience. The organisation was 2 flights for artillery cooperation and 1 for reconnaissance on the squadron. And one of the squadron commanders, who's from 1916 onwards, he says, each flight had 4 aircraft, a handful of NCOs and air mechanics, serviced the aircraft and ran the flight's quota of transport, one of which was converted into a combined office and stores. Thus, each flight was self-contained and capable of working independently on detachment. Now here's an interesting fact about they were working with lots and lots of artillery. So a station signals section was run by the signals officer, trained WT expert. He was responsible for the WT equipment of all the aircraft and ground stations. The latter consisted of a WT station at the aerodrome and a large number of battery WT stations, 1 for each battery in the corps for which the squadron worked. It was between 20 and 40 stations. Each one had a simple receiving set and a mechanic to operate it. He was attached to the battery for which he worked and moved within the corps. The signals officer looked after them on the principle of a grocer doing all his rounds. He would set off on a light tender loaded with WT spares, spare clothing and mail for the operators, and perhaps a couple of relief operators to replace those who'd been in the line a long time or wounded. So again, is quite new sort of concept. You know, you've got all these people working with the squadron, but they're in 40 different places and on the front line with the artillery. We talk about liaison. Again, Davidson talks about artillery cooperation. Up to the end of July 1916, the squadron held on charge 5 excellent horses. They were originally intended to give officers exercise in their leisure hours, but they became chiefly responsible for the excellent liaison between ourselves and the artillery. Pilots and observers who had carried out shoots in the day, all were detailed for the morrow, invariably combined business with pleasure by riding cross-country to the batteries concerned to discuss details of their work. This procedure became a routine, the results of which were very encouraging. Maltby talks about artillery cooperation. In the winter of 1916-17, we saw great developments in the methods of drawing up and carrying out trench bombardment and counter-battery programs. Headquarters artillery drew up thorough programmes nightly, and these were issued to all concerned and were followed up the next night with tabulated results. In cases of failure, the cause was given, frequently in terms which were hardly kind. The sense of competition and keenness which this system produced bore excellent fruit. 2 other practices were employed which I am confident assisted towards efficiency. Observers were worked up to buzz at 16 words per minute. This led to them working at about 12 words per minute in the air. Their messages took less time to send, with the result that their chances of jamming were largely reduced. So again, if you think about this, they were actually being jammed at this stage. It's, you know, something that wouldn't really occur to you. And they were able to observe appreciably larger numbers of rounds during one flight. I used to examine and criticise every wireless log myself, and after having had it criticised by the wireless officer from a technical point of view, we used to send it to the officer who originated it. It turned out to be a method which produced quick and accurate work with minimum effect. Portal, who was a squadron commander later, chief of the air staff in the Second World War, in order to promote better understanding with the gunners, we used to invite several artillery officers to stay with us in our mess for a few days. They, in turn, used to invite us to stay with them at their batteries. This gave us the chance to study each other's problems and iron them out. We took visiting gunners on shoots to help them appreciate what it was like from our end. This did a lot to overcome the thought that a second lieutenant in the air is trying to control my battery. This sprang from the code G, which meant fire. What it really meant was, if you fire now, I'll be in a position to see your flash and later the shell burst. The artillery obviously believed, why is these young upstarts telling me where I've got to fire? And certainly at first, the artillery didn't necessarily do the corrections because the artillery were the technicians in the army. We'll go on to the artillery. We've got the development there. We'll go on to the Artillery Corporation, the clock code. A Captain Douglas Swain Lewis of 3 Squadron devised a clock code, and they pioneered this with the use of a radio alongside Major Salmon of 3 Squadron. The whole idea of this really was that you had the clock code there, you know, if you look at 9 o'clock and you see the fall around about here, you use, if it's 250 yards to the left, you see you would put CA9. And they're saying 250 yards to the left. So it gives an idea of where it's falling. The artillery then correct it so that it gets back onto the centre. That was the main, that was used for specific targets. What they did used to do as well was they used to use maps which would go down for zones as well. So an artillery battery would have responsibility for a zone, usually 1,000 yards by 1,000 yards. So if a zone call was made, that artillery battery just blasted the whole kilometre as well. So you can see here now, this map is courtesy of Lieutenant Campbell of 4 Squadron in 1918. You can, if you look at the other side of the map, there's a lot of blood on it where he was injured and then evacuated home. But his son, who lives in fairly close to me, had this map. You can see the map there. It's all divided up. It's all fairly efficient, and I'll just go through how this works. You've got 6,000 yard squares with 36 zones. Note that the logic on this, if you put A, B, C, D, I think most logical would be 1 to 9 in there. But what they did was they went right across 1 to 6, 7 to 12 that way, because they changed the system halfway through. These became, in 1915, smaller zones A to D. What they then do is put the numbered squares, which you saw the 36 of, into a numbered square there, and you change it to 1,000 yards by 1,000 yards. So number 19 there. And if you look very closely, you can see there there's a sort of hashed line as well, which reduces those squares to 500 yards. And here, those 500 yards are sub-designated A, B, C, D. So at that stage, you've got a 500-yard square that you can bring it down to. If you use the principle you would use if you were map reading, you can split that into 10 mentally and then bring it down to a 50-yard accuracy when you're looking for something. Okay, so on the next one here, we've got this point here, go along the corridor and up the stairs, as you always do. So that would be 3 and then 4. Then you could have the zone call message here of FB, NF, N19, so 19 is the area, C, little block, little area C, along 3, and then up 4. And then the 3 that they do there is that is my third call. This was an anti-jamming thing, so they couldn't repeat the call. Okay, so with this development, they could get their registering of targets within 50 yards. Quite impressive, I think, really. If you look at how much artillery they were doing, that's the flying activity board for 16 Squadron on the 14th of May. Unfortunately, it should be the 16th of May with 16 Squadron doing 16 aircraft sorties. But things never work out that way, do they? Okay, go on to contact patrols next then. In Ober's Ridge on 9th of May 1915, the Army saw potential for the support of Army cooperation to see where the infantry were getting to when they were doing attacks. There's a comment here. The wireless sets in use at that time weighed 5.5 stones. Consequently, with the wireless on board, it was impossible to carry an observer. So they did evolve, and the roles that came through, effectively a crew was allocated to a battalion. They then went and liaised with that battalion in great detail about the attack. They then flew the sortie and knew exactly what that battalion was supposed to be doing. Their main aim was to inform the HQ of the infantry's progress. The great idea. What the idea is that Tommy Atkins, in the front there, lights a flare when he's at the front so that the aircraft can see where he is. One minor problem with this is so can the Germans. So Tommy Atkins is not going to go and do that, is he? Another option was an aircraft flying by, does a klaxon with the Morse code A, like that, and the front line of troops light their flares up again and say, we're over here. Again, not really going to happen. So a lot of work went into how on earth are you going to get those forward troops to do stuff. In practical cases, basically, the aircrew would fly along looking for khaki as opposed to field grey German. They would fly along until they were shot at as well. That gave them a good idea as to how things were going. They tried all sorts of things. On the Somme, they put triangles on every 10th man with metal triangles so that you could see glint in the sun. They didn't like doing that. They then sort of said, oh, well, we'll get them to use mess tins. And what they did eventually, by 1918, they tried all sorts of things. They tried. There's one series of trials that I got a file for, which are brilliant. They're firing party streamers, they're dropping balloons, they're doing all sorts of things. And in the end, what they came to was no soldier is going to get rid of his gas mask. So they actually put a reflector on the gas mask so that they could then see that, because nobody's going to throw that away. They tried all sorts of things. And, you know, you can understand the army, the infantry, is not going to want to expose himself just so that the people know where he is. The idea was also to report enemy positions and reserves, which was really the critical thing. They were to transmit messages from the troops on the ground. This was supposed to be battalion HQ that sent the messages, But again, really, really unwieldy and time-consuming. And to support the infantry with machine guns and bombs, and that was obviously a very useful thing that they could do. So if we go on to the contact patrol signals, the battalion and brigade headquarters were signed with great big white sheets, 10 yards with lead weights on them, so that you could see that that was a brigade and that was battalion. And a little bit later on, they decided to put this arrow with the number of yards that the battalion HQ was away from the front line of their troops. So again, quite easy to read on the air and quite easy to report back with that sort of thing. On the ground, they were supposed to pass these sort of messages. So the infantry, using a Aldis lamp or shutterboards, would pass a message, and the aircraft would then transmit that back to headquarters, to Corps headquarters or Army headquarters. And if you look at some of these things, one of them is, "We're all right." Well, not really worth passing that one on, is it? You know, could you raise the barrage? Could you lower the barrage? Could you give us a barrage? You know, it's really, really impractical. And it was unwieldy, and it very, very rarely worked. If we go on to the bombing now, if you bombed with a BE-2, and a lot of the case in an RE-8, you were carrying 112-pound bombs and no observer, because the observers were all sort of around about that sort of weight. There is no bomb sight, and the pilots were encouraged to aim by feel, sometimes bombing from about 6,000 or 7,000 feet. So not really much choice of doing things. I'll give you an idea of the results. 1915, raid on Zeppelin sheds in Bruges, 6 aircraft, good weather, unopposed, not a single hit on target. I've got to tell you about a second Lieutenant Thayer, this story is one of my favourites. 27th February 1916, there was a bombing raid of 31 aircraft ordered on the town of Don. Due to poor weather conditions, not a single aircraft hit or even found the target. Thayer took off at 10:40, flew towards the lines with 2 112-pound bombs. He lost his bearings in a snowstorm and landed at 2:20 p.m. in Sheerness. He started on his way back immediately, but was compelled to land at Herne Bay due to the bad weather and waited until next day. On the 28th, he got no closer than Folkestone, and finally, after 2 landings, he returned in the afternoon of the 1st of March. His bombs were kept by Marines at Herne Bay. Okay, and a little bit later, I discovered the Squadron had a sort of mess magazine and things like that. And they had this little poem in it. There was a young man named Thayer who one day took to the air. When his fuel was spent, he landed in Kent and surrendered at once to the mayor. Now, I will not do Thayer an injustice here. 3 weeks later, he was commended by the Army commander for good work. He left the squadron, went to Bristol Fighters, and became the top ace, along with Captain Cubban on 20 Squadron on Bristol Fighters. He got an MC and a bar and was killed, shot down by his own artillery about a year later. But he was a very, very commendable man. You know, you don't get an MC and a bar and become the top ace on Bristol Fighters without having a good war fighting spirit. Okay, we go on to special missions next then. This is quite an interesting one. You could have almost a whole talk on this. Davidson talks about in April 1916, they decided to have an offensive campaign against balloons. They got some harpoons. They got some things that you set fire to and just dropped. And they also got some incendiary bullets. They tried an incendiary bullet into a haystack from 10 yards, and it didn't set fire to it. They then decided phosphorus bombs, that's a good idea. So they got these phosphorus bombs. They were quite flimsy and homemade. And as they were taxiing out, the vibration of the aircraft caused the bombs to drop off, set fire to the aircraft, and they set fire to 2 other empty hangars at the same time. You imagine this aircraft going around with everything on fire. Didn't use it very often. So I think that one fell by the by. They also were used occasionally, not 16 Squadron very often, but for troop ammunition supply. 9 Squadron were destined to do nothing but that for the Battle of Amiens, dropping 1,000 rounds of Vickers gun ammunition. What a waste of an aircraft. Okay, that sort of covers the roles now. So we'll go on to activities. We've got Ober's Ridge, 1915. And here we've got a quote of, in 1915, the use of wireless telegraphy for directing artillery was already widely employed. 16 Squadron extended this function further during the Battle of the Ridge on the 9th of May by using its wireless-equipped aircraft to report the progress of advancing infantry. So there you go, you've got the first case of contact patrols using the wireless at that stage. So the results obtained were not brilliant, but the potential was very good. We got on to Dowding, Chief of Fighter Command in the Second World War, was a squadron commander, known as Stuffy. Not the greatest commander. And Archibald James will give you a little, his rundown.
He was known then by all of us who ever worked with him as Stuffy Dowding, a pretty apt nickname. Dowding...
Why was it apt?
Dowding, in a matter of 3 or 4 weeks, reduced the morale of a first-class squadron headed over by Holt to near mutiny.
I told you he was quite opinionated. That was one view of Dowding. Grenell Milne didn't like Dowding at all, but one of the flight commanders, Wright, says this about Dowding. I was returning late one evening from a reconnaissance and arrived back in darkness to find the large bonfire had been lit to help me land. I looked down and saw the land swarming with people. I heard later they were Indian troops who were expectantly waiting to see me crash. Dowding, who'd been in the Indian Army, suddenly arrived and raged at them furiously in Hindustani, and they fled. How I admired old Stuffy. Okay, so Dowding did actually leave the squadron under a bit of a cloud with a recommendation that he didn't have control of personnel. There we go. We now go on to sort of more interesting war experiences of people. We've got Captain Ward here, 30th of November 1915. His description is excellent here. While concentrating on the camera's needs, I had my attention drawn by Buckley to an albatross a little way above us. We had a perfect view of his black-coated observer operating his machine gun. Firing short bursts, we circled one another. We soon ran out of ammunition, so there was no alternative but to run for home. Our opponent evidently had the same intention as he turned away. Just then, however, a blood-curdling shriek came from our engine, and it stopped dead. The 4 blades of our propeller, usually invisible, now stood out starkly motionless like sails of a disused windmill. We were at 6,000 feet and only a short distance behind the German lines. Our predicament didn't seem unduly serious, although we were making little headway into the wind as we lost height. We might or might not be lucky enough to flop down just behind our lines. We were a sitting target for the German infantry in their trenches, their rifle and machine gun fire only too audible without the comforting sound of the engine to disguise it. Part of a wing strut and other bits of our machine were now disappearing, but to land on the German side was unthinkable, although I had a thought we may only get to no man's land. Buckley looked round inquiringly, and I nodded in a way that was intended to be reassuring. Just then I felt a sharp burning pain in my left leg, in response to which my right foot gave the rudder bar a jab that put the machine into a turn, thereby losing our remaining height. We skimmed crab fashion over a trench full of soldiers. Buckley was now wisely climbing out of his seat, and I saw him jump clear as the machine hit the ground. In a scrunch of splitting wood, I was somersaulted forward and pinned upside down at the aft end of the fuselage, folded over onto itself like a scorpion's tail. German soldiers came running up and stood there gawping at the wreck while I shouted and cursed with my legs in danger of being crushed by the swaying fuselage. Buckley, now captive, was being led away. The tail of my aircraft was eventually lassoed and hauled back, heaving me the right way up. Efficient hands lifted me out, and I was taken to a communication trench on a stretcher and eventually to a field dressing station. The doctor finished some painful probing and tidied me up and left me with an interpreter who asked me to hand over all my possessions. He then asked whether I would like to send a message back to the squadron. Remembering what had been done with Gay and Leeson, so there's good cases here, I was only too glad to write a short note. Was there anything else I wanted? Yes, there was. I'd very much like to meet the airman who'd shot me down. The interpreter seemed rather doubtful about this, but promised to make inquiries. In the hospital ward, filled with badly injured Germans, I felt very conspicuous in a khaki shirt, and I was glad to think I'd never engaged in bombing. Later on that day, 2 German officers in resplendent uniforms were ushered into the ward. Clicking their heels and saluting simultaneously, they introduced themselves and in hesitant French expressed their regret at bringing me down. They left parcels containing a bottle of Grand Marnier, 100 cigarettes and a carton of chocolate eclairs. The doctor was delighted with the Grand Marnier, the orderlies were grateful for the cigarettes, and the nurses appreciated the eclairs. So I think that's a great thing here. And the one thing for me with that is the note that he sent to the squadron that was dropped by the Germans in a bag to the squadron. Now, I think you all hear stories of the notes being dropped and messages being passed through. This is actual evidence of it. It's held in the Imperial War Museum, which for me was a real, I found that very interesting to get that. We'll carry on then. Major Power was in charge now. We replaced Dowding. And they started on preparations for the Somme offensive. They went down to a new airfield and they worked with the Australians who were coming back from Gallipoli in a quiet sector. Major Maltby, who took over the squadron in June, said in 1916 there was no organisation through which to deal with intelligence and to issue orders. The normal practice was to rope in a capable observer to help. This was done in addition to his flying duties. Now, as an ex-member of 16 Squadron, I could say that fine tradition carried on for ages because the navs did all the hard jobs and all the pilots did the very easy ones and the glory ones. But there we go, that's just for the video. The squadron strength was raised from 18 to 24 in February 1917. And we've got a little bit about in September 16, they did some offensive actions in the Somme. On the 9th of October, 2nd Lieutenant Franklin and Sergeant Tollervey attacked German machine guns that had been firing at them during an artillery shoot. They observed the enemy trenches were full of troops, so landed at one of the advanced landing grounds and arranged with battery commanders for a combined shoot on the machine guns and trenches. They moved to Bray. Maltby says, at first our billets were inconveniently scattered all over town, but an energetic equipment officer whose methods hardly bore careful scrutiny soon made us comfortable in 5 hospital huts and a host of other major buildings. What they did do at this stage was they were starting to get more and more professional as they came along, rather than just having an observer who was doing the collating stuff. There is actually a book on the squadron of all the shoots that they did, handwritten, and it's fascinating. I copied a whole month's worth. I wanted to copy the whole lot, but I didn't have time. That's in the RAF museum. But it's fascinating to go right the way through what this person was doing. This came from this branch intelligence office. Okay, so they formed these branch intelligence officers all over the Army Corporation squadrons. They collected, collated and distributed all intelligence, dealt with interpretation of air photographs, briefed and debriefed air crews, and acted as a main link between the Corps and the squadron. So they were a very efficient way of operating at that stage. Maltby says, in early 17, a branch intelligence section was added to the squadron. It contained a trained intelligence officer who the Canadian Corps supplied and 2 clerks with a typewriter. Little had previously been done in the matter of cross-examining crews after flights, or in giving them detailed instructions prior to the reconnaissance, both of which were responsible for the improvement of the information obtained by the observers. The Corps commander came to attach great importance to the BI section, frequently visiting it himself. And in fact, a little bit later, I wish this guy wouldn't keep coming here. He was in every other day or something like that. Of course, they had to treat him because he was very high ranking. They had to treat him well. Activity in 1917. On the 11th of January, they had an air raid, a night raid, and it did considerable damage. It destroyed Sea Flight's hangar, 5 aircraft were destroyed, and 3 airmen were injured, of which 2 died of the wounds later as well. Sort of thing, again, you don't really expect that sort of thing. And certainly in 1918, there were quite a lot of air raids and things like that, but that early in January 1917, get an air raid like that. They then started preparations for the Vimy Ridge offensive. As they were attached to the Canadian Corps, they were the main operators for the Canadians. They had really good flying conditions prior to the Vimy attacks, and there was a high pressure zone over, and it was very, very cold. And they say here, it was bitterly cold ground and it was snow covered. This helped the observation of the fall of shells. It also revealed work on the trenches and fortifications. Most valuable of all, it revealed gun blast marks on the ground in front of battery positions and betrayed occupied positions. Maltby talks a little bit about photography as well. By this stage, they got up to the P-type camera. And he says, prior to the Vimy Ridge attack, we had only the old P-type and hand-operated cameras for oblique and vertical photography. Photographs with the former were most popular with the Canadian Corps just before the attack, as they gave such an excellent perspective view of the hilly ground over which the attack was to pass. Mosaics with the latter were somewhat difficult to ensure. The hand-operated camera often left serious gaps. In addition, the area behind Vimy Ridge was carefully patrolled by the enemy fighters. The consequences were that reconnaissance missions were seldom able to completely work without being attacked several times. We found that formations of 3 or 5 working at hours when our offensive patrols were due to be in the area was the best method of ensuing success. It was useless to send any but our most experienced pilots in these formations, as they were the only ones capable of holding together under the conditions in which they had to work. So very difficult situations there. And again, we're talking about March 1917, just as the stage of Bloody April's coming in. We have here a mosaic of Vimy Ridge for that, which was from the squadron. So we had fine weather in the middle of March, but the weather was absolutely appalling on the Easter Sunday when they did the attack. There was no German aviation interest at all at any stage. But they say here, Australian crews, Second Lieutenant Crowe and Durham, saw an enemy battery limbering up in order to retreat. They descended to treetop height and shot up the horses of the gun teams. The result was that the guns were abandoned and fell into the hands of the Canadians that were advancing. The guns were supposed to be sent to Central Flying School at Uphaven as a trophy for the squadron, but they never got there. Okay, we'll carry on with the activity, and I just hinted about this. The German air superiority was coming at this stage. 16 squadron were flying BE-2s, absolute sitting ducks at this stage. The first casualty on the squadron was February the 1st, Lieutenant McRae and Murray, and they both died of wounds the next day. I'll go on now to Captain Massey and Lieutenant Vernon, who we'll come on to right at the end as well. They had a combat with Werner Voss, famous ace. Vernon was killed instantly, shot through the head. The aircraft was on fire, and so Massey landed it, and fortunately he landed in snow. So his burns were sort of less bad than they would have been. Massey is, if you remember the Fast Show with Unlucky Elf, this is the man. Massey then went to casualty clearing, badly burnt, decided to evacuate him home. He went on to the transport, the ship hit a mine, and he was in the sea for 5 hours. He then took nearly a year to recover in Lincolnshire, near Cranwell. When he started flying again, he broke his leg playing rugby. Go on a little bit longer, 1928, he's in Iraq, he broke his leg again. He was roller skating. By 1941-42, he was a group captain. He became a station commander on the Stirling Squadron. Station commanders weren't supposed to fly on ops. He snuck into an aeroplane, and guess what happened? It was shot down. Stirling was shot down. And you may have heard of him as well, because he was the SBO in The Great Escape. He was the group captain that was there. So quite a colourful life that he led. We'll carry on into bloody April, really, with 3 more stories. Captain Garland. He'd just been sent over to 16 Squadron. Conditions at 16 Squadron were very different to my old squadron. Number 16 was nearer the Somme front, where the war raged and the atmosphere was different. The quarters were rough and ready, and the officers messed like a canteen. Casualties were so high, we hardly had time to get to know one another. I was soon to learn what it was like to be attacked by enemy fighters of far superior speed and ability. And he says on the 6th of April, again, took bail-in on photographs, no escort. 2 of the BEs were taking photos of the next sector, and I saw 3 Albatross scouts attack first one, then the other, quickly shooting down both in succession in flames. One was Whittaker and the other was Knight, who was with me yesterday. Both had observers. The same 3 Huns then turned their attention to me, but I kept close watch on them and made off at full speed over our side of the lines the moment they turned in my direction. They didn't attempt to venture to our side of the lines, and I managed to get all of my photos while the Huns patrolled their side of the lines. I felt a bit off seeing those 2 go down in flames. Went to 10 Squadron for lunch. Yeah. How would that be treated nowadays? We go to Captain Bird. A DSO was awarded to Captain Bird. The citation reads, when on artillery patrol, he succeeded in reporting 13 active batteries, observing fire and silencing several of them. On another occasion, he attacked and scattered with machine gun fire 2 parties of the enemy which were forming up. The operation was carried out for 2.5 hours in very adverse weather conditions. So he got a DSO for that. His observer at that stage was Lieutenant Stout, and this is a different sortie. This is over the Vimy Ridge time, where he got an MC. When on infantry contact patrol, he flew twice for periods of 2 hours at very low altitude, and on each occasion brought a very complete and detailed report on the situation of the attack. He has at all times displayed great courage and skill. He joined the squadron on the 4th of January 17, and he was killed on the 30th of April when he was shot down by Lothar von Richthofen on a contact patrol. And we go, and this is the war diary book that I copied a month's worth of. I'm not sure whether this was actually written by this Captain Davison. I think it could well have been. Okay, we now go on to Routh and his report, combat report on the 21st of April. The CO sent for me and said, I'm sending X over to Long to get some vital information. I require a machine from your flight to go as an escort. God, what a thought, a real forlorn hope. One BE2 to escort another. Futile, of course, but nevertheless, orders is orders, and I thought this is where I meet my end. Being the flight commander, it's only right I should go myself. As soon as we crossed the lines, hell was let loose. We were only about 500 feet up, and he had to fly low to get his information. Every gun, machine gun, and rifle which could be brought to bear on us was blazing away. Black smoke from the guns was all around us. Bullets were passing by us. Was I frightened? Talk of the cold sweat of fear. It was horrible. Added to which, I could hardly keep up with X. He was going so flat out. He did not waste any time over Long. No sooner was he over than he turned for home. Back through the barrage. It was worse and even more intense than the outward journey. But luck was with us so far, and we reached our lines. I heaved a sigh of relief, and that was the hottest journey I'd ever had in my life. Certainly the most terrifying. I got out my map and started to make a reconnaissance of the German barbed wire. I'd made 1 or 2 notes on the map when I happened to look round to see where X was. What I saw filled me with horror. His machine was on fire and he was halfway to the earth. He'd jumped out. At this instance, I was shot through the hand. Why I was not riddled, I don't know. The machine was hit in front and behind me. My observer also escaped unhurt. My enemy was in close attendance. He dived, but I didn't let him get a lead on me. I found myself getting nearer and nearer to the earth. My observer was doing his best to get bursts in at the Hun, but he was not very successful, chiefly, I fear, because he kept moving the aeroplane violently around the sky. I was now below the level of the ridge, the Hun still in attendance, engine damaged, and blood was streaming from my wound. There was no alternative but to land amongst the shell holes. I flattened out and waited for the crash, but no, my luck held and I landed without even tipping on my nose. The troubles were not over. The Hun was determined to get us. He dived, firing as he came. His shooting was not too good, and I jumped out and into a shell hole, yelling at the time to my observer to give him help. That was the Hun's last dive, as one of our machines had spotted him. I watched and to my intense relief saw him shot to pieces and dive straight into the earth. The next thing to do was to get bound up and give the information I'd got to the gunners. I found a battery a few yards away where I handed over my report, was dressed and given half a tumbler of neat whisky to restore my somewhat shattered nerves. I was sorry for the observer. The experience had been too much for him. His nerve went and I heard that he never flew again. One day like that is sufficient for a lifetime. The following morning, the CO of the hospital came round to inquire how I was. I replied that I was well, but suggested he might employ someone with a little more skill to tie up the arteries. He apologised and passed on. I noticed the matron getting pink and then slightly purple. I'd said the wrong thing, as it was the colonel himself who'd stitched me up the night before. Now, that again was Lothar von Richthofen, who claimed against the other aircraft was Second Lieutenant Mitchell, and his observer was Captain Rogers. The observer that he mentions, Second Lieutenant Mackenzie, flew again on the 24th of April, 3 days later, and again with Artillery Corporation on the 26th. So that element of it didn't necessarily tell the truth. Captain Routh says at the end of this, "It was a sad ending to nearly 10 months flying over the line. Ours was not spectacular. We did the humdrum work for the army. We plodded along, preparing the way and helping the soldiers in their struggles. We could not take the offensive into the air, for we had neither the speed nor the armament to do so. Nevertheless, the lives of thousands upon thousands depended on the thoroughness with which we carried out our duties." And I think that is the testament to the Army Corporation squadrons, and most of the fighter squadrons should take heed of that. Okay, we now go on to the RE8. So in May 17, the squadron was re-equipped. There were reports of the RE8 being a bit dangerous, and people didn't like the idea of it. One had crashed on delivery, another one had crashed when it was in Saint-Omer. And in typical Trenchard fashion, when they delivered the first one to 16 Squadron, he was in the back seat to prove to the fact that it's okay and it's safe to fly in. Okay, at this stage, I think it's worth saying as well, the observer was very much more a gunner in the RE8 than he was in the other. All the photography stuff was generally done by the pilot. And Portal says this: "Behind the observer was a fixed vertical camera, projecting through a hole in the fuselage. It had a magazine on top, and after exposure, the plate was moved over by the pilot pushing the wire. It then dropped into the magazine underneath. The pilot also, by pulling a small lever, operated the shutter after taking aim through a vertical sight on the outside of the machine. Each plane was fitted with a wireless set operated by a Morse code key by the pilot. The aerial, which was about 100 feet long, trailed below and behind the machine in flight, with a lead weight at the end. It was attached by a large hand-operated drum, like a fishing reel, behind the observer's cockpit. It was the observer's duty to reel in the aerial at the commencement of the flight and to reel it in before landing, a duty which he nearly always forgot to perform, to the great wrath of the wireless sergeant." Okay, we now go on to the RE8. They developed the cameras much better at this stage as well. The L camera, Flight Sergeant Laws; the LB, Laws Brabazon. Okay, with the RE8 arrived the L and LB types of mechanically operated cameras. These were a great boon and enabled aeroplanes to work more quickly as well as accurately. We found it was safer to send single machines on photography in spite of the fact that enemy aircraft were still a serious menace. Single machines could seize a clear opportunity and complete a couple of runs more quickly than a formation, which attracted too much attention. Demands for prints became very heavy at time. Careful inquiry proved that many were demanded by lower formations as they might be useful. We carry on in the activities in 1917. Maltby, before he left the squadron, says this about the pilots. Pilots were arriving with very little flying experience. They knew nothing about artillery cooperation and had to be taught everything after arrival. This could not be helped as the shortage at the time was very great. The majority were very keen and learned quickly, in spite of the extra work which was thrown upon the squadrons by this system. I feel sure it produced efficient cooperation pilots in the shortest time. A great mistake was to send them out knowing so little about air gunnery. I suppose that this was also unavoidable. Many hardly knew how their guns worked, much less how to use them or how to manoeuvre if attacked. Hence the numerous casualties amongst the last joined. I estimate that 11 of our killed, missing and wounded were experienced pilots and observers, and that 40 were inexperienced. So in that stage, you lost nearly 50 people, sort of February through to May. Maltby talks about the French population. An old lady complained about liaison between her daughter and an airman. The girl's husband was away fighting. The complaint was about the interminable string of tins of bully beef that she received. Could she please have something else like plum and apple jam? The Canadian Corps, the squadron moved to Comblain on the insistence of the Canadians, basically. There were messages of thanks from the Corps commander, and the squadrons usually stayed in the same area, but they moved with the Canadians for it. It was a real compliment to get that. We now get Major Portal arrives. In May 1917, I was sent to command number 16 Squadron, which had had a very bad time during the Vimy fighting, losing about 50 officers in 2 months. The squadron had just been equipped with the RE-8. He says about artillery shoots. For the best results, the pilot flew in an elongated figure of 8. He gave the signal G that he was ready to observe when he was approaching the British battery. As soon as he saw the gun flash, he turned 180 degrees so that he was approaching the enemy target by the time the shell burst. When a pilot became experienced, he might be able to observe as many as 3 batteries on as many different targets simultaneously. This was hard work, as you had to have 3 separate notepads for each battery. During the last months of 1917 and for the rest of the period of the static warfare, these methods of cooperation were made almost perfect. The last 81 shoots which I observed for were all successful. And I think 81 missions that he's done. And that's the squadron commander. Each aircraft had code identification which was transmitted to the Royal RFC wireless operator attached to the Corps artillery. These men had the most unpleasant conditions to endure. And I think it's worth considering what these people went through. We've got a Mr. Fred Jarvis in 1960s. He sent this message through to the squadron on one of the anniversaries. We all lived in the firing line, sometimes in the front line trenches with trench mortar batteries, and usually within a mile of the field or garrison artillery. We had to endure gas attacks, high explosives, liquid mud, and worst of all was the vermin. We lived in the line day and night, year in, year out, with only 10 days leave every 12 to 14 months, acting as liaison between the aircraft and the batteries. The wireless operator's receiver was a bit Heath Robinson, with complicated procedures for erecting the aerial. There was a simple system of ground signals using 10-yard lengths of cloth with lead weights to hold down the ends. Okay, we now go on to the high spirits. One of the flight commanders, Stretfield, his comments are usually quite interesting as well. He says, "We somehow procured a small trench mortar, and in order to play about with it, we dissected a number of smoke signal bombs and extracted the small gunpowder charge from each one to fire the projectiles from our mortar. This left only the candles that burn with a yellow, acrid smoke. One day, Portal and I were on top of a slope that stretched from our airfield to Canadian Corps HQ, and with the wind in our favour, we set them alight. A horrible cloud of yellow smoke was given off and wafted slowly down the hill towards the HQ. Pandemonium set out. Gongs sounded, whistles were blown, men shouted, and people could be seen rushing around in gas masks. At this stage, we thought it prudent to call a halt and sent a message by motorcyclists to Corps HQ that we'd had an unfortunate accident with a smoke bomb at the aerodrome and that the smoke, although unpleasant, was harmless. We also added we were sorry for any inconvenience that caused. The truth, of course, was never revealed then nor later, as far as I know it, by the future Marshal of the Royal Air Force. Major Portal, again, he really led from the front, this guy. They were tasked with night bombing in 1918. During 1918, night bombing by moonlight was ordered. All the pilots enjoyed it. It was considered a soft job compared to work with by day. But I doubt whether pilots can fairly be expected to work by day and night for any length of time, or mechanics for that matter. 31st of January, he crossed the line 5 times between 1 o'clock and 6:30 a.m. The RE-8's bombing capabilities. Again, if you had the 212-pound bombs, you couldn't carry an observer. And we go into this for the escort bombing missions. The squadron was ordered, this is Stretfield, the squadron were ordered to carry out an attack against which I ought to have protested even at the risk of getting the sack. It was against a long-range gun at Courier. They were to attack in daylight, and Major Portal led the formation, which was attacked by about 20 aeroplanes. Portal and a few others flew with observers in lieu of a fighter escort, the other RE-8s only having bombs. A dogfight with about 5 hostile aircraft lasted about 10 minutes. 3 enemies were shot down and another 2 disengaged, just as his observers' ammunition had run out. And this contribution was part of his DSO, the bar to his DSO, which was ordered in April 1918. Stretfield talks about the German offensive. During the German offensive, every squadron within reach immediately sent every available machine loaded to capacity with bombs and ammunition, with orders to let loose at anything German they could see. We flew at about 200 feet, and it was a remarkable sight to see the number of British planes streaking south. It was shocking and heartrending to see lines of German infantry advancing in perfect orderliness over football fields, which our troops had been using only the day before. They were followed closely by their artillery batteries and shortly behind their transport wagons. In front of them, there seemed to be little organised resistance. We just went for whatever we saw, infantry, artillery or transport, loosing off bombs and machine gunning from low altitude. So far as we could see in the general confusion. Our interference was very effective, although we lost a lot of machines, and those of us who survived were lucky. In fact, the squadron was quite lucky. They only actually lost 3 aircraft altogether. They lost 1 by anti-aircraft fire on the 25th of March. 1 crashed and ditched, effectively, and both crew were prisoners of war. And now, if I just go on to honours and awards, I think it's worth mentioning here that the airmen, again, didn't have a very easy time of it. And when I was looking at the awards, you get the MCs and the DSOs and things like this. But I found this thing, there's a Sergeant Mottershead, who's the man that's kneeling down with the dog. It's not related to the Mottershead who got a Victoria Cross on 2 Squadron. But they used to have to go out and salvage the aircraft, which didn't necessarily just mean salvage the aircraft. And here we've got the citations for meritorious service medals for 3 of the airmen there. They're difficult to read, but it was a gruesome job. This one is for the 3rd of August, where they had to go into no man's land and bring back the crew and anything that was of value in the aeroplane, like the instruments, things like that. And the next day, 3rd of August, on the 4th, the whole squadron went to the cemetery at Aubigny, and Lieutenant West and Todman, who'd been shot down the night before, were buried. But these guys, they used to have, it must be quite a horrendous job to go into no man's land and bring 2 bodies back. Okay, they moved to Braille on the 21st of October to follow the advancing armies, and then they moved again just before the end of the war. The final patrol. They did an Armistice Day patrol. Now, I'd like to mention here Captain Tracy and Captain Davison, MC. Captain Davison's granddaughter has been in contact with me. She saw this talk up in Scotland. And she sent lots and lots of really useful and very informative information about her granddad. And he's quite easily identifiable because he's got a walking stick. And they said they took off at 10:15. At 11:15 they landed and reported, no enemy aircraft seen, our troops in Mons, AA fire nil. And that is the end of 16 Squadron's activity for the First World War. The squadron were transferred back to England on the 12th of February 1919, and they were disbanded in December 1919. I'll just go through a quick summary of the losses. 1915, fairly light, 2 killed in action, 3 wounded. You notice here as well, there's quite a lot of killed accidentally. That, certainly within the squadrons, you see that there's a lot of that. 1916, fairly quiet year, but 3 killed in action, 13 wounded, 1 died of wounds. 1917 though, 28 killed in action, 30 wounded in action, 14 missing. That's obviously the height of the bloody April. And then 1918, once they got the RE8, they were flying a lot more sorties by this stage as well. So proportionally, they were losing less. Now, I think it's, as an end here, while I was at the National Archive, the squadron admin files had replies to letters of condolence from the squadron commander. And I saw this and I thought, well, I've got to have a read. I read through the letters. I've got copies of all of them. And they vary from one like this, which is Corporal Rolfe's widow, who was very young, very poor. Her card was written on a postcard. You've got some postcards shrouded in black. You've also got letters that came, one of them came from a lord. And so the whole scope of society was hit on 16 Squadron, never mind anybody else. But these letters are really, really poignant. And I think it's worth mentioning this. And she says it's very difficult to read there, but Corporal Rolfe was an airman who worked as a gunner, volunteered to do some gunnery. They got paid an extra 3 shillings a day if they did it for each trip, basically, which wasn't their motivation. And it says here, I was hoping great things of him, and he doesn't seem possible I'll never see him again on earth. He died for his country, and in a way he himself would have chosen. And she carries on, I hope someday to come to France and visit the spot where he is resting now. God only knows how I shall bear the terrible loneliness. But thousands of others have great sorrow too, and we must all try to help one another. Now, I'll just leave that there. Last night, someone sent some information through to me about a Lieutenant Keir. And I'd been looking for letters written by the squadron commanders to the families. And in the biography of Lieutenant Keir, we have here the letter that Portal wrote. I'm writing you a few lines just to say how very sad we all are at your son's death. As I expect you know, he was attacked in the air today at 3:45 by a German scout, and after putting up a very fine fight, was at last brought down. I have seen his body this evening, and he looks quite peaceful and happy, having been killed instantly. His observer, Captain Wasey, was also killed, shot through the heart. It may be some small comfort to you, as it is to me, to know that he died fighting and suffered no pain. He was a splendid boy, keen and energetic, and a pilot of great promise. He was immensely popular, and I feel I've lost a personal friend, as well as one of the most promising of my pilots. Please accept my deepest sympathy at your great loss. Yours very, very sincerely, CFA Portal. And if we now go on to the last one, Mrs. Vernham. Now, Noel Vernham, shot down with Massey, shot through the head. He started life as an airman mechanic, left the army, then went to do his observer training in September 1916. He married Violet Vernham in November 1916 when he'd finished his training. He was shot down by Werner Voss on the 4th of February 1917. So he didn't have very much of a shelf life there. And her letter says this: I should be so glad of a photograph of his grave. Could you send his things home to me? I think there was a small miniature photograph of myself in his tunic pocket, a little known book of Shelley's poems. Also, a photo of myself at his billet, and there may have been one or two little personal things of his. Anything as long as it was his. It is all I have left. He was so happy in his work. And I'll finish on that tribute, really.